Welcome to chess, ladies and gentlemen. Malignant Young Pocket Dieting inside my chest, ladies and gentlemen. Appreciate you guys very much for coming by. So I do have the legend himself, Garry Kasparov versus Wesley. So, taking out a round 2. And so, I think this was the game that was very heavily talked about. It has a some very interesting features in it. This is actually a really greatly played game by Garry Kasparov. You know, not giving away like who won the game or not. I think a lot of you guys have already seen this this game. I know that Roderick Nava did do this game, I think yesterday or day before. So it's already been pretty heavily covered. But I figured I'd just go ahead and post it anyway. You never know. People might want to look at my take on it. But for all my people in the Philippines, I will say mabuhay to you. Kumusta na aking makaibigan? Ingat lagi mabuting pagbati. I appreciate you guys very much. Maraming salamat aking makaibigan for post na nunawod. Appreciate it very much. But if you guys are ready to get rolling, let's take a look and see what we have for this game. So we got E4, E5. Knight comes to E3. Knight to E6. C3. Knight to B6. We have long castles by white. G6, G3, C6, a knight coming to B3. So as you guys can see, this looks very similar to the Shankland, the Shankland So game, with some slight differences. But we do have long castles by black. D4, pawn takes D4, pawn takes D4, and then we do have D5. In this position, white has a really nice center established, so you have to try to combat it some kind of way. And the best way in the position is actually D5. We see E5, closing the position up, far-reaching our pawns, seeing what we can produce from that. So knight comes to C4, offering a trade of the knights. It's a little bit inconvenient to trade in this position because you are going to be attacking this knight, and the knight and the rook are both protecting the D4 pawn. So what's Garry Kasparov says, I don't want to trade, so he goes knight to G4. We see F5, asking, do you want to break up your pawn chain by capturing en passant, or do you want to just move the knight? And so Garry Kasparov, he decides to move the knight. And we have actually reached a position. There's a very nice tactic involved. It requires a lot of deep calculation, though. So if you want to go ahead and pause the video and see if you can figure out this move, go ahead and do so. Okay, it kind of looks like a non-move because, as you guys see in the position, D4 square is very heavily covered. So it doesn't really make a lot of sense, I think, from first looking at it, but it is a pretty monstrous sacrifice, and it is actually knight takes D4. So if you guess knight takes D4, congratulations. You are pretty gangster, and you are like fearless in the face of death. It's crazy because, like I said, you have to calculate pretty far into the game to be able to actually pull this off. And I mean, this is definitely something that Wesley So is capable of doing. So I'm not sure if I'm sure he saw it, but I mean, maybe he calculated to a certain point and was like, nah, that's not good. Or maybe he just didn't have enough faith in it being strong enough against maybe Garry Kasparov. I don't know. You have to ask Wesley So. But anyway, the depth of this is knight takes D4, bishop takes E5, which is a nice fork of the knights. Knight taking G8, bishop taking D4, rook taking D4, queen taking D4, bishop to C3. You have to prevent, the checks that are going to be coming up, because this bishop is loose on on B1. Queen taking F2, rook to G2, queen to E3 with check, bishop down to D2, knight taking, rook taking, and then rook down to D6. And you have actually managed to trap this knight. Now, if we back up, after queen takes D4, bishop to C3, queen takes F2, you might be wondering, okay, can't I just save the knight by going knight to F6 here? Because, I mean, or even knight to H6. We'll just deal with knight to F6 for right now. I mean, it just seems like you're able to escape your knight some kind of way. Like if you go down here, You know, you have the ability to at least kind of like, you know, get it protected and stuff like that with the bishop. Unfortunately, this would be a horrible blunder. Knight would come to f6, and you actually see queen to e3 with check. And then the king would have to go up to c2. Because this rook is now not protecting laterally. So you're just going to be getting mated if you don't be careful. And then d4 comes. And this is really, really nasty. This is bad because now you've just cut off the connection with the knight. And this bishop has to move because it is attacked. And this pawn is very fast. So that is that. So like I said, I mean, as you guys know, that's very deep calculation that is concerned. So we're looking at least like 6-7 moves deep into these variations. So logically, Wesley So just said, I'm going to go ahead and just go for the more logical line. And he went rook to f8. You know, just getting the rook out of the way of the attack. And so Garry Kasparov goes knight takes e8. We see rook d takes e8, and then we see f4. And as you guys can see, I mean, this is a really, 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 really beautiful pawn chain. So black cannot allow that to stand. Black is about 3/4 of a pawn up right here. You know, they have a really good position. They do have double bishops against double knights, but they do have a really, really strong pawn center, just kind of cutting into black's pawn center. So that is definitely a feature that is legit. And Garry Kasparov plays this very, very legitimately. We see g5, and not taking or playing rook over, we actually see queen to f3, which is the best move in the position. And, I mean, we're just ready to take back with this pawn, and then it's like, you don't really have a lot of other pawn breaks now. And then, you know, this pawn there's an issue with this pawn, so, you know, Garry is, I mean, he's playing, like, you know, very, very nicely. So queen comes to g7. Bishop comes to b4 because, I mean, we're just extra preventing c5 from coming. So, I mean, this is pretty dominant. Rook comes to f7, which is the best move. Knight comes to c5. We want the blockade of this like pawn to be gone. Also, what we're thinking of too is if we can remove this knight, you know, we do have some possibilities in the future of bishop taking f5. And, you know, we have some pretty deadly threats on that diagonal. That's more of a dream case scenario, though. Queen comes to h6. We see knight takes e6, rook takes e6, and then we do have b3 knocking this knight somewhere. We have a counterattack of a5 from Wesley. Bishop comes back to c3. We see knight down to a3. And we really, really don't want to give up that bishop that I was talking about earlier because, you know, we are thinking of some possibilities of bishop taking f5 at some point. So we do play bishop to d3. Now, if we back up, there was actually a really, really nice, like, exclam move that white had, and it was actually pawn takes g5. Now, you're allowing a check to come up, but you're going to be blocking that check with the bishop, and that's important. Queen takes g5 with check, bishop to d2, queen comes to g4, and you're not worried about trading. Queen takes d4, pawn takes g4, and then bishop to d3, and you have a lot of threats in the position. I mean, you have the rook swinging over, so you're going to be taking over this file. These bishops are pretty monstrous. You know, you definitely have the ability to move this bishop down and attacking here. So the nature of the position being as open as it is, it's definitely favorable for white. So going back, like I said, we did see bishop to d3. We see g4 closing the position, which is something that black would probably want to do a little bit simply because you do have a knight. Even though it's looking really, really like sad over here on a3. It's not like the most ideal square for it, but it's really kind of hard to attack there. So we do see queen down to e2. And, I mean, this is just like, so up to this point, like, you know, Garry has played like very strong. I mean, this is pretty much, he's ahead enough to where this is really just kind of his game to lose. So if he doesn't play, you know, if he like kind of messes the game up, then he definitely could give the game away. But, I mean, if he plays like Garry, the Garry we know, I mean, he could definitely win this game. So we see queen back to f8, just making sure that we protect that knight that's just really chilling over there on the rim on a3. We got h3 trying to break down this structure that black has and try to give, you know, why not give yourself some more passed pawns and do some pinning. I mean, you know, of course, if we can do this here, this is going to be pretty deadly. So we have h5. Pawn takes g4, pawn takes g4. Black is not trying to allow that to happen. Bishop comes down to b2. We see rook over to h6. And this is actually the point in the game that everybody was talking about. Like, I wasn't even familiar with the game all the way, but I mean, when I was on YouTube, there was like, literally thumbnails that were saying like E6. And I was like, I don't know what's up with this E6. Now I know what they're talking about. E6 is the most like demolishing move in the position for white. It gives like +6. So it's like a rook and a pawn's worth of an advantage to push this E6 pawn. And it just like pretty much demolishes black position. I mean, there aren't a lot of great moves after E6. Garry actually goes rook to H1. So this just like plummets like the advantage that he had. So if we actually look at E6, you have two pretty much different options. I mean, you can move this rook somewhere laterally, or you can just move the rook in the way. The problem is moving the rook in the way just blocks blocks the queen's ability to protect this this knight, and this knight will be on pre. So we can't do that. So we would probably be looking at rook F to H7, and then E7 would actually come. And it looks weird because you're like, wait a minute, why? Like, why am I just allowing, that situation to come up? Well, actually, you're gonna win a piece. Rook is gonna take on E7, and then you actually have bishop takes A3, throwing that little intermezzo in there because now you are pinning this this rook down to the queen. Bishop would come to D6, rook takes D6, rook takes D6, and then bishop takes F5 with check, and you are trying to deflect this queen away from this rook. So this is just, I mean, it's just very, very deadly to push E6 in this position. So like I said, we did have rook to H1. We see rook F to H7. Rook takes H6. Rook takes H6. We see queen over to G2. Bishop comes to C7. We see rook over to H1. And this is all still very good. I mean, just because like Garry didn't push E6 doesn't mean that he's like blunt. I mean, I guess technically you could call it a blunder, but I mean, it's just, am I blurry? Have I been blurry like for a long time? That's bad. Okay, hopefully it hasn't been a long time since I've been blurry. I wasn't looking. Okay. All right. But yeah, hopefully Garry, like he's playing good. So even though, you can technically consider that a blunder, he still has a very dominant position going. So rook takes H1, queen takes H1. We see king over to B8. We see queen down to E1, and we see A4. We see bishop to C3. And so, like I said, I mean, Garry is still continuously playing computer moves like this entire time. So we see bishop back to D8. We got bishop to B4. And this is a very annoying move to me. And the only way to defend against it is bishop takes E7. Or bishop to E7. Bishop takes E7. Queen takes E7. We see king up to B2. Knight comes back to B5. We see bishop takes B5. We see A3 throwing that in the little, Zweichenszug move in before we recapture. King goes over to C2, and then we see pawn takes B5. And we actually see queen to A5 by Garry, which actually just like, okay, so if we back up, after this move, it's insane because he actually has E6 again. And if you push E6 here, there really is nothing for black to do. The queen is like literally stuck on E7. And I mean, there aren't any good pawn pushes literally anywhere. And you have these double pawns over here, which don't help you at all. So for some reason, I feel like Garry Kasparov thought that, I mean, he just wasn't that great. And he just wanted to play the safe like route and go queen to A5, maybe attack B5 and something. I'm not really sure, but I mean, E6 in this position is just insane. I mean, like I said, there's nothing to do. There's pretty much like king moves or maybe a B pawn move, either one of these B pawns, but it doesn't matter because this queen is coming into E5 and it's attacking both of these pawns. And you're basically just cleaning up those two pawns, and now you're just going to get two more pass pawns. And then you can also pick up this G4 pawn if you want. So, I mean, let's just say, for example, you go queen to C7 with check. The king is just going to move up. So the king is actually going to improve its position. And you now have to move back to E7 because you cannot allow this pawn to push, because then you're going to have to sacrifice your queen for that newly promoted queen. So the queen is going to go back to E7, and then you have queen to E5, like I said. And there's just nothing to do here. You're going to be cleaning up these two pawns. You can possibly grab this one if you want to. You're going to be possibly grabbing this one if you want to. It's just, there's just no possible way to win this. And this is +10. So he had the opportunity earlier for +6 and for +10 here. So it's it's disappointing to see, Garry like not calculate these things out, because I mean, he was the #1 player in the world for 20 years. And he was a former world champion. So it's like, you kind of think that he would maybe see these things. So I'm not sure, like, how he didn't see E6 like 2 separate times. Like, I mean, I don't know. But anyway, going back to what we had, he did go queen to a5. Queen came to h7. And now you're in a position to where, like, you have to pretty much defend the position by basically just checking the king mercilessly. Queen comes to d8, king goes to a7, queen goes to a5, king comes to b8, queen comes to d8, queen goes to a7. And they're repeating moves, so there is a draw agreed here. And like I said, I mean, you know, you can think like, hey, man, I'm going to go ahead and grab this pawn. But the problem is you're looking at queen to h2, and now you're just going to give up a couple of pawns of your own. The king is going to come up to c3. And then, I mean, you can either take this pawn or you can take this pawn. It's all saying it's drawn, but, I mean, that's just a lot of counterplay that you're allowing. So you just kind of made the game, like, a little bit too hard for yourself to go queen takes d5. So the key here, and the key, like, at another point in the game, was actually just to push e6. And it just kind of seems like, I mean, it's a passed pawn right here. So it's like a pretty logical thing to push it. I mean, you know, it's kind of one of the sayings in chess. Passed pawns must be pushed. So I'm not sure how e6 didn't come 2 separate times, but I mean, I'm not Garry Kasparov, man. I mean, I don't know how I do in a game with him, so I like to think I do all right, but I don't know. You never know, man. So, but yeah, that is that game. So they ended up drawing by agreement because they hadn't repeated 3 times yet. But I mean, they saw where the game was going. I mean, Garry Kasparov was just going to continue to check Wesley, so that's pretty much how that went down. I did forget to speak Russian at the first of the video. So if anybody is still watching to this point, I will say Привет, Доброе утро, Спасибо for coming by and taking a look at my video. And again on the end, Spasibo for coming by and taking a look at my video. And Meraming Salamat Aking Makai Bigan Posa Na Nunawod. Thank you very much, my people in the Philippines, for watching, and I will see you guys next time.